Good morning. Class is about to start. You can come up to the front row. You won't get called on. I promise. Everybody here? Everybody awake? Okay. I'm Jane Harman, escapee from the United States Congress, where I served 9 terms, which is 119 dog years. It's a very long time. I've been at the Wilson Center for 6 magical months as president and CEO, and I get to do neat things like what I'm about to do. Congress and everybody in the world is worried about the budget. The budget is very important, but I actually think Congress and everybody in the world ought to be worried about a 5-letter word spelled W-A-T-E-R. Agree with me? Yes, you do. And that's why I'm proud to welcome a Californian, Peter Gleick, back to the Wilson Center to launch the 7th edition of the World's Water. I think all of you know that Peter is the head of the Pacific Institute, which is now 25 years old, he just said.
Yep.
Peter and I happen to be about 5 years older than that. And the Pacific Institute is one of the world's leading experts on water. He was awarded a MacArthur Genius Grant. That's a cool thing to get. And is a member of the National Academy of Sciences. This is the 4th time we've launched the World's Water at the Wilson Center. And we'll do it another 100 times, Jeff DeBelco, if we have to get attention paid. Our environmental change and security program has worked closely with Peter and his colleagues for more than a decade on water issues, focusing on water's role in interstate conflict and cooperation through the Navigating Peace Initiative. Currently, our China Environment Forum is collaborating with Peter and Circle of Blue to produce the exciting Choke Point China multimedia series on the alarming growth in demand for water and energy in China. And by the way, we're all talking here about maybe taking it global and calling it Choke Point Planet, something you can all help us with some near term. In this edition of World's Water, Peter and his colleagues tackle key issues including climate change and what it means for our water resources, U.S. water policy reforms, heightened conflict over water, the impact of national gas fracking on water quality, and the geopolitics of dam building in China and Southeast Asia. We look to experts like Peter to bring these issues to the attention of the policy world here in Washington. And Peter, I want to thank you for your leadership in California and for your contributions to the Wilson Center and to this global problem. Thank you to all of you for coming today, and especially a shout out to Jeff DeBelco, who is the director of our Environmental Change and Security Program, who will moderate the session. I will now sit in the audience, where I should, in the front row, along with a few brave souls, and listen to as much of this as I can. Thanks again for coming.
Well, thank you very much, Jane. It's a privilege to have you here calling attention to these issues and introducing this session. One of the tremendous privileges at the Wilson Center, that the formal memorial to President Wilson, is to be able to learn from and work with distinguished former members of Congress. And Jane Harman is our director, and as I think many of you know, succeeded Lee Hamilton. So it's been a great privilege for all of us here at the center to have engaged leadership that is interested in what the research and the academic community is trying to tell the policy community and interact with the policy community. As I think you know, the Wilson Center is honoring Wilson's legacy as the only president to have a PhD by being this forum for interaction between the worlds of research and the worlds of policy. And it is terrific to have Peter Gleick coming back to the center. He's been a longtime friend of the program, and we've been pleased to have the opportunity to engage him in discussion because he is always has done his homework, always is provocative, and always is pushing us to be more ambitious and not just settle for the art of the possible, which is so often the case in this town, but to really understand the magnitude of the problems and be more ambitious in terms of how we try to tackle them. It's also I think Peter reflects what we are trying to do with the Environmental Change and Security Program and the Wilson Center more broadly, which is bring different communities together. He does that in part with his work on climate change, his work on water, his work on the connection of those issues to broader foreign policy, security policy contexts. And so in that way, even just taking a look at the participants list, you'll see folks coming from those different communities here, and we appreciate his insights and analysis in bringing those together, and we appreciate you making the time to engage in this discussion, get out of your particular comfort zone and individual sector to engage across these issues, which frankly they're integrated in real life, so we need to find a way for our academic, our political, our NGO institutions to tackle these things together. And so we appreciate Peter giving us the opportunity to do it, and Peter, we'll turn the floor over to you for a presentation, then we'll have a Q&A.
Well, thank you very much. President Harman, much better than Congresswoman Harman, but first of all, thank you for having me, and thank you for your introduction. For those of you who don't know, and there's probably no one in the room who doesn't know, Congresswoman Harman was from the time when, as somebody else put it, we had grown-ups in Congress. And your service has been remarkable. Your experience on the issues of security and some of the environmental issues, I just want to thank you personally. I've admired you for a long time. She didn't say this. She thinks I'm from the wrong half of California because she, of course, represented part of California, a different part of California for a long time. Thank you also to Jeff. Jeff has been a colleague for many, many years, a friend, has done remarkable work on the issue of environment and security and all of the kinds of things that the Woodrow Wilson Center has addressed. And our connection goes back a long time, and it's always a pleasure to be here. This is one of my favorite audiences. It's one of my favorite places to speak. And so I appreciate the opportunity to come back. Thank you also to Island Press. Island Press has been publishing the world's water for now 14 years. This is volume 7 of this biennial report. They've been a loyal friend throughout this process. They always encourage me to do another volume. And it's been a pleasure to work with Island Press. And Jamie Jennings is here, and David Miller, and my editor isn't here, but I appreciate all of the support that they've given me. So water is a big topic. I'm going to barely scratch the surface of the kinds of issues that we address in the volumes of the world's water or at the Pacific Institute. But I'm going to give you a little bit of a flavor for what's in the current volume. I'm going to give you a little bit of a flavor for some of the challenges facing us in the world today and some of the current issues. And then we'll see where it goes. And there will be time for some Q&A at the end. This is the 7th volume. This is the first 6 volumes of the world's water. And there's the 7th volume. Some of you have picked it up outside. I encourage the rest of you to pick it up when you can. What I'd like to do at the beginning is talk about what's new in volume 7. And that requires in part talking about some of my co-authors, because this is not something that I do alone. It's something I do with colleagues primarily at the Pacific Institute, which is an independent research institute in Oakland, California. There's a chapter on climate change and transboundary waters, and you'll see my co-authors listed here. There's a chapter on corporate water management, the risks facing businesses around water, the issue of corporate social responsibility around water. Talks about something called the UN CEO Water Mandate, which is an international effort to bring some international standards to reporting around water, to how corporate sectors ought to behave around water quality and water quantity issues. We talk broadly about the issue of water quality in a project that we did with the United Nations Environment Program that's summarized in Chapter 3 on global water quality issues. We look at the issue of fossil fuels and water quality. The Institute has worked for many years on the issue of energy and water, how much energy is required for our water systems, how much water is required for our energy systems, and one of the pieces of that puzzle is the connections between our use of fossil fuels and water quality. There are very serious implications to extracting fossil fuels, to using fossil fuels, including but not exclusively this new issue of fracking. not really a new issue, but it's a new issue in the media, it's a new issue in the public awareness, and that is hydrologic fracturing of rock formations to enhance our production of natural gas. It's an issue in Pennsylvania and New York and Texas and Wyoming and France and increasingly around the world. We're worried about water quality issues associated with this hydrologic fracturing process. And we talk about some of the scientific issues, some of the policy issues in this chapter. Chapter 5 is a case study about Australia's drought. For those of you who follow extreme events or climate change or Australia, you'll know that Australia has just come out of an incredibly severe 9-year, multi-year drought that some people think may be a sign of things to come for much of the rest of us, for those in the western United States, for example. And we talk about the hydrologic characteristics of that drought. We talk about what climate scientists in Australia think about climate change and that drought. We talk about the policies that were implemented during those drought years and some of the extreme things that Australia had to implement that, even as bad as things have been in the western United States, we have not yet begun to think about. Things have not been bad enough in the western United States, despite the fact that we love to fight about water compared to what's happened in Australia. We have not implemented the kind of policies that Australia had to implement because of that drought. Chapter 6 is about China dam policy. I'll come back to this a little later in the talk, but it's about the growing emphasis that China is putting on big dams, both inside of China and outside of China, and I will come back to that. And Chapter 7 is about U.S. water policy reforms, and I'll come back to this as well. In addition, every volume of the world's water, they have these chapters on critical issues, but there are what we call in-briefs, water briefs, that are shorter pieces, and we've had in-briefs about the origins of water on the planet. We've had in-briefs about water on the moon, or on Mars, or on Venus, or on different planets. We've had in-briefs about all sorts of different things. But this time, there's an in-brief about the energy requirements to produce bottled water. For those of you who know or don't know, I wrote a book about bottled water last year. There's a little piece in there about energy and bottled water, but this expands on the energy requirements to make the plastic, to chill water, to treat water, to move water from one part of the planet to the other in the bottled water industry. I did notice that. In fact, I meant to mention that. The days when they could get away with inviting Peter Gleick to give a talk and then put bottled water on the podium are not yet over, but the people who do put bottled water on the podium are increasingly embarrassed. And certainly Jeff and the Woodrow Wilson Center know better. Along those lines, I bring my own tap water wherever I go. So thank you. Put that down there. There's a chapter about the new Great Lakes Water Agreement, that we have a new agreement with Canada over the Great Lakes, the management of the Great Lakes, an international body of great concern to the two countries, and I think it's 8 states in the U.S. and the Canadian provinces that share the Great Lakes, and we talk about that agreement. There's in brief about water in the movies. I'm a scientist by training, but I love movies, and you would be amazed at how many movies, Hollywood movies, documentary movies, talk about water. Chinatown comes immediately to mind for many of you, but there are a lot of other ones, going back to the 30s and maybe the 20s, with some of the westerns and the ranchers fighting over water rights in the western U.S. in the early part of the century, the 20th century. There are science fiction movies about water. One of the James Bond movies was about water. Quantum of Solace, those of you who saw it, was about the evil bad guys trying to capture the water supply of Bolivia. It's a great list. So if you're desperately looking for something for your Netflix list, you've seen all the movies you think you want to see, you can't figure out what to put on your Netflix list, here you go. And the water conflict chronology, which I'll come back to again later in my talk. And then every volume of the world's water has a series of data tables. Some of them are repeated and updated. Table 1 and Table 2 are always the amount of water by country or the use of water by country, updated every 2 years. Tables 3 and 4 are access to water and sanitation by country, updated every 2 years. So some of them are updated, and then some of the tables are new, depending on critical issues of the time. And you can see what's in the volume, this volume. In general, though, the series offers 3 things. We offer major concepts around water and how to think about water. We offer important data and trends over the last few years. And we offer case studies and what we call success stories, things that are working in the water world that might point to solutions, that might point to policies and strategies for moving from where we are to where we want to be, which I would argue is sustainable use of water most broadly. So, for example, the Australia chapter is a case study of how we deal with extreme events, how we implement policies when we're forced to think about long-term constraints on water availability. So that's an example. And going back over the last few volumes, one of the major concepts that we address all the time in the books are the soft path for water. It's something that I've written a lot about. It's a strategy for moving towards a sustainable future in the water area. And the soft path for water means, in our description of it, safe and affordable water for everyone on the planet, restoration of natural aquatic ecosystems, new institutions for managing water, or better institutions for managing water, rethinking of water demand and use, so that we're moving toward more productive use of water everywhere. And for those of you who know about the work of the Institute, we've spent a lot of time thinking about how to improve water use efficiency and conservation. In the Western United States, where there is no more water to be had effectively, we have to think about productivity and efficiency of use. We have to think about how to do the things we want with less water. And we're moving in that direction already. It also means rethinking supply. Supply in the 20th century meant building another dam. It meant building another aqueduct. It meant tapping another groundwater reservoir, another aquifer. Where we're running into constraints on water supply, we have to rethink what we mean by supply. We have to think about treated wastewater as a resource, not as a liability. We have to think about smart conjunctive use of surface water and groundwater together. We have to think about rainwater harvesting. There are new sources of supply out there, but they're not the traditional ones. And figuring out how to get institutions to move away from old thinking about supply to 21st century thinking about supply has been a theme in the world's water from the beginning. It means new technical tools, new regulatory tools, new financial and economic tools, proper pricing of water, water markets, and systems for managing water. All of these things together are what we call the soft path for water. It's new strategies for moving towards sustainable thinking about water. And in a way, every volume of The World's Water addresses some aspect of this. Almost all of the chapters apply this kind of new thinking to move away from the old policies and strategies for dealing with water. We've also talked from the beginning about environmental security, and this is something that Jeff and the Woodrow Wilson Center have done for a long time. We've worked at the Pacific Institute on the connections between environment and conflict from the beginning of the Institute. We did very early work on water and conflict. We did very early work on climate change and conflict. I wrote a paper in the late 80s on the opening of the Arctic and what that means for resource strategies as climate changes. And the Arctic is opening. We've done a lot of work on conflicts over water. And so, for example, in the very first volume, volume 1, there was a chapter on conflict and cooperation over water. In 2000, we wrote about the geopolitics of international river basins. In 2002, there was a chapter that talked about how to manage water across political boundaries. It would be nice if our watershed boundaries and our political boundaries matched, but of course they don't. And you think about the Western United States and those square states out there like Colorado and Utah and Nevada and Nebraska and all of those where we drew boundaries with rulers, but the watersheds don't work that way. So the Colorado River is shared by 7 states in the Western United States and Mexico. And borders are drawn like that everywhere around the world. They don't match our hydrologic boundaries. And so how do you manage water that crosses borders? In 2006, there was a chapter about the connections between water and terrorism. In the newest volume, there's a chapter on transboundary water and climate change. The water conflict chronology, which again I'll come back to, is in every volume. It's updated in all 7 of the volumes. We've also done a lot of work for a long time on climate and water, as Jeff mentioned. Again, in the very first volume, there was a chapter on climate and hydrology. In 2002, there was a chapter on the impacts of climate change on the water resources of Pacific Island nations, something that continues to be a problem. Just in the last 2 or 3 weeks, and I probably should have shown some of the news stories about this, but just as there's been a terrible drought in Texas, which we hear a lot about, there's been a terrible drought for the exact same reason on island nations in the Pacific. The natural variability of La Nina, El Nino has played a role in this, and there has been no rainfall for 6 or 7 months or longer in Tuvalu and some of the other island nations. And these are islands that are completely dependent on rainfall. And when they get a drought, they have no other options. And so there's a new discussion going on about climate change, long-term climatic variability, and the vulnerability of some of these islands. 2004, there was a chapter on climate change in California water resources. California is very vulnerable to climate change. It has a long coast. It's vulnerable to sea level rise. It's very sensitive to storms that come off the Pacific. In California, a dry year is a year when we get 1 or 2 fewer storms off the Pacific. A wet year is when we get 1 or 2 more storms than normal off the Pacific. So we're very vulnerable out in California. In 2004, we published links to the Water and Climate Bibliography, which is an online bibliography that lists thousands of resources, scientific resources about the connections between climate and water. 2006, we talked about floods, droughts, and climate change. 2008, there was a chapter on water management and climate change. And in the current volume, there's a chapter about transboundary waters and climate. Oh, and Australia's drought, which has a little section about climate change as well. In 2008, we wrote about peak water, and the Woodrow Wilson Center did an online video about the concept of peak water and what we mean about peak renewable water resources and peak non-renewable resources, and we introduced the term peak ecological water and what it means. In 2000, we introduced the issue of the human right to water in the volume, and in 2004, we wrote about the human right to water again. It's something the Pacific Institute has been working on for a long time, the human right to water. And interestingly, last year in 2010, after decades of debate about this, the United Nations passed a binding resolution declaring a human right to water. And then the UN Human Rights Council passed a resolution on the human right to water. It's actually a remarkable set of resolutions declaring a human right to water. And now the debate has shifted. We now acknowledge there's a human right to water, and now the challenge is, what does that mean? What are the responsibilities of countries and organizations in the context of a formal human right to water? And I would argue that all of these combined offer to some degree a different way of thinking about water, an integrated way of thinking about water. Water is a great topic because it's connected to energy, it's connected to climate change, it's connected to human health, it's connected to natural ecosystems, it's connected to international and national security. And I think over the last 14 years, we've come to realize more and more that if we want to solve any of these problems, we have to think about them in a different way. We have to think about them in a more integrated way. We're not going to solve our energy problems unless we think about water. We're not going to address climate change unless we think about the hydrologic cycle, which is the water cycle, which is the climate cycle. We're not going to think about security properly unless we think about connections with environment and population dynamics and demographics and water resources and transboundary resource disputes and equity. So my lens is typically a water lens, but I think none of us can think about the problems that we really care about unless we think about a more integrated approach to all of these challenges. As I said, every volume of the world's water has data and trends in them. One of the reasons we're interested in water data is because we want to know where we are. What's the current state of the world's water? But we also want to know where are we going? What do the trends tell us about things we ought to be looking at? And I would argue that despite huge advances in data collection and management and monitoring in hydrologic sciences over the last decade or so, we're still, there are huge, vast gaps in our knowledge and understanding about water. And I'll give you a few examples of that. But first of all, we don't know where we are. We don't know how much water the world has. And you'd think this would be pretty fundamental, but we don't know how much water there is on the planet. We don't know where it is. We don't know accurately the flows of dynamics of the hydrologic cycle. So we have water in stocks, ice sheets, groundwater, in our bodies, in our lakes. We have water in flows, in rainfall and evaporation, in moving from one stock to another. And we sort of know how much water there is, but it's remarkable how inaccurate that knowledge is. And so right off the bat, we're at a disadvantage. If you really want to manage water, it would be nice to know pretty accurately where it is and where it's going. We don't know the key components of the hydrologic cycle or the world's water balance. We don't know how much water humans use. So table 2 in every volume of the world's water is how much water by country each country uses. If I told you that the data in that table are a compilation of measurements and model estimates and complete fabrication, maybe you wouldn't be surprised, but that's the reality. In California, we don't accurately know how much water we use. In any state of the union, we don't accurately know how much water we use. We approximately know, but we don't measure a lot of these things. So, for example, the estimate for how much water agriculture uses in California, it doesn't come from a measurement at every farm of how much water they apply. It comes from approximations. So that's true around the world. And frankly, our data system in California is better than our data system in a lot of other places around the world. That's a problem for water management. We don't know how much water ecosystems need for health. How much water do fisheries really need? And of course, ecosystems are suffering because all of the water that humans use come out of ecosystems. How much water should we leave in the system for natural ecosystems? We don't know. That's partly a scientific question. It's partly a political question. And we don't know where we're going. So here's a graph of the blue line is actual water withdrawals worldwide. And if I told you that number, we didn't, that's sort of a made-up number too, because we don't really know that. But then all of the little dots are projections, are scenarios for where we're going. Now, obviously, we're not there yet, so we don't know where we're going. They're guesses, they're scenarios, they're projections. There's some hydrologists or engineers or politicians' projection for where we might be in the future based on when the model projection was made. So the reddish little dots are projections that were made before 1980. The green triangles are projections that were made after 1995. And as you can see, before 1980, the assumption has always been our demand for water is going to grow exponentially. And that comes from the assumption that our population is going to grow exponentially, our GNP is going to grow exponentially. The assumption has always been, well, okay, then our water use is going to grow exponentially. So most of those projections are based on population projections and some assumption about how much water every person on the planet is going to require. They were best guesses. So after 1995, our projections changed. And they changed in part because our demand for water seemed to be starting to level off. And our projections got a little more sophisticated. We began to realize that, okay, if you were on the red line, pretty soon you're using all of the water on the planet, so maybe that's not going to happen. So they changed. But the bottom line is we don't know where we're going. I couldn't tell you which of these is more accurate because it depends on assumptions about our economy. It depends on our assumptions about technology. It depends on our assumptions about a lot of things that we can only make guesses of. But the difference between the red line and the green line is huge. The implications for our use of water are enormous. This is how many Colorado rivers, how many Niles, how many Mississippis to meet this difference. This is a tremendous difference, and it has enormous implications for policy. So we don't know where we are, and we don't know where we're going. And we have to be careful with the data we do collect. And in the data world, there's something called the Goldilocks principle. You can have too much data, you can have too little data, you can have just the right amount of data, but you don't use it properly. And here's a classic example of that. I'll let you read this. Okay. So I don't know who in the town of Snowmass put this sign up, but it was brilliant. So we misuse data all the time for lots of things. And so data collection is important, data management is important, and data use is important as well. The good news is that new tools are becoming available. So this is the spreadsheet that they tell you, this is the PowerPoint slide they tell you never to put up. This is an Excel file for that first table in the volume of the world's water. Total renewable fresh water supply by country. This is actually a snapshot of the 2010 update, the new volume 7 update, and it lists the countries and it lists the total water resources in cubic kilometers per year and the year of the estimate and the source of the estimate. Okay, so this doesn't tell you anything. But there are new tools that are visualization tools, that are online tools, that are internet tools, that are mapping tools. And you can take those data and you can do something like this. This is a map using something called World Mapper that shows the outlines of the countries of the world by their share of the water resources of the world, proportional to their land area. Okay, so look at Brazil. Fat Brazil. Because Brazil has the Amazon. Proportional to their share of the land area of the world, Brazil has a lot of water because of the Amazon. Look at the United States. It actually looks sort of like the United States because on average, the United States has about the amount of water per square mile of land area of the United States as the rest of the world on average. Now, the western United States is dry and the eastern United States is wet. So if we were dividing the United States up, the eastern United States would be fat and the little western United States would be scrawny and shriveled up, like the Middle East. Look at the Middle East. There's no water in the Middle East proportional to their land area. And so they barely get any land area at all. So there are new ways of visualizing data. There are ways of taking the information that we have and actually thinking about them a little differently. All right, so look at this map. This is the resource, the natural resource of the water on the planet. The next map is the same thing, but it's water use by country. All right, so all of a sudden the United States has gotten a little bit fatter and Brazil's shriveled up comparatively. And look at Asia, China, and India, and the Southeast Asia. So per unit land area, our use of water is not necessarily proportional to our land area or to our populations or to the water that's actually available in each country. So you can look at water availability, you can look at water use. There are new ways of thinking about data that maybe help us think about some of the challenges and maybe some of the solutions. There are new ways of collecting data. There's a satellite in orbit now. It's actually a twin satellite called GRACE. GRACE is there's a great video, which I'm not going to show you, but it's two satellites almost tethered together. I don't think physically they're tethered together, but they're traveling in orbit, one behind another, and they are mapping gravity on the planet. The gravity on the planet turns out to vary depending on the mass of the planet, the mass they're traveling over. And by mapping incredibly sensitive variations in gravity on the planet, it turns out they're actually able to measure water use. Because when you use water, water varies. The mass that you're using varies. You're using up water in one place, the gravity goes down a little bit. This is a map of groundwater withdrawals from northern India based on gravity variations over time from northern India. And it shows the massive overpumping of groundwater in India for agricultural production. So the little red areas where groundwater's gone down, the blue areas is where groundwater may have gone up over time. We don't measure groundwater on the ground in India, but we're now able to measure it from space. There are new tools becoming available to collect data that we had not previously collected. We have the same map for California that shows enormous overdraft of groundwater in the Central Valley of California, which we know about, but we don't measure very accurately. So a couple more facts and figures just to give you a little bit of a flavor for what's in the current volume. More than 1 billion people still lack safe drinking water worldwide. 2.5 billion people still lack access to adequate sanitation services worldwide. And I know there are people in this audience who were at my last talk or have heard me talk before. I talk about this all the time. This is the world's biggest problem, in my opinion, biggest water problem, in my opinion. It's the failure to meet basic human needs for water. And I could have shown these same numbers in 1998, and I probably did. It's true. We still have 1 billion people without access to safe water. We still have 2+ billion people without access to adequate sanitation, and it's inexcusable, and unfortunately it hasn't changed much. I also talk in this volume about the Millennium Development Goals. This may not be the first time you're going to hear this, or maybe it is, and my crystal ball is no better than anyone else's, but I'm going to say that I think we're going to fail to meet the Millennium Development Goals for water and sanitation by 2015. The Millennium Development Goals are goals set by the UN to reduce poverty, and there are Millennium Development Goals for education, for health, for basic poverty indicators, and for water. 2 of them are water, and they are to reduce by half the proportion of people without access to safe water and sanitation by 2015. Not to provide everybody with safe water and sanitation by 2015, just to reduce by half the proportion between 2000 and 2015. And we're not even going to meet those goals. I could be wrong. I don't think I'm wrong, but I'm going to say now that I don't think we're going to meet them in 2015, and the world's water, this volume talks about that. Even worse, deaths and dailies are what we call disability-adjusted life years. They're a measure of illness for water-related diseases are going up, not down. So it's another measure of our failure to provide safe water and sanitation, and I'm going to show you a couple of graphs about that in a minute. But we're moving in the wrong direction for water-related diseases. There are more water conflict chronology entries, and I'll talk about a few of those in particular. Bottled water sales are not going up exponentially anymore. When I first gave this talk, the first graph was from 1970 to 2008, I think it was. We had incredible growth in bottled water sales in the United States and worldwide. They're not going up exponentially anymore. There was a dip. The bottled water industry argues pretty vociferously that that dip was due to the recession and had nothing whatsoever to do with the growing discussion, might be the best way to put it, about bottled water and how appropriate it is. And in fact, bottled water sales went up again last year. There was a sort of, I'll show you the graph, there was a drop and then an up and down. But I think that's an interesting number. And despite the fact that environmental concerns may not be at the top of people's concerns overall, for environmental concerns, water is at the top. For those people who are really concerned about environmental issues, they're really concerned about water. And I'll show you a graph about that too as well. So here's progress in meeting the Millennium Development Goals. On the y-axis, it's regions by major regions of the world. The former Soviet Union, countries of the former Soviet Union, Oceania, Western Asia, Southeast Asia. In red, those are the regions that are not on track to meet their Millennium Development Goal targets for water. This is rural water. There are separate graphs in the book on rural water, on urban water, and on sanitation. This is just the rural water graph. The blue regions are regions that might be on target to meet the Millennium Development Goal objectives. So when I said that the world as a whole isn't going to meet their goals, I think that's true, but some regions are on target and some regions are not. Interestingly, some of the regions that have done the best are still not on target to meet their next step. So if you see Southeast Asia has done a pretty good job at meeting their rural safe water targets, but they're not on target to meet the remaining unmet need. And Sub-Saharan Africa, as always, tops the world as the region most desperately in need of safe water and sanitation, and most desperately unable to meet progress in those areas. So CIS is split into two. It's part blue and part red, in part because CIS Asia countries are not on target. CIS European countries are more on target. That's why there's a little split there. This is the deaths from water-related diseases for 2000 and 2004, which happens to be the latest data from the World Health Organization for the world as a whole. The blue are diarrheal diseases. The red are other water-related diseases. So you can see two things. First of all, we're going in the wrong direction. Deaths are going up. And second, it's dominated by diarrheal diseases, cholera, dysentery, that kind of thing. Diseases that we know how to solve, that we know how to prevent, but that we have failed to prevent because we're not providing safe water and sanitation. And you can see it's over 2 million a year. This is the same thing for these disability-adjusted life years. That's the equivalent of one lost year from illness. A year of sickness is a daily. And again, you can see two things. First, it's dominated by diarrheal diseases, and second, it's going up. But there's another interesting thing here, and that is, in fact, the illnesses from non-diarrheal disease, water-related diseases, are going down. A bigger fraction of these is diarrheal diseases. We're actually making progress on things like trachoma, something, for example, the Carter Center in Atlanta has worked very hard on guinea worm. So we are making progress on some water-related diseases, but not on diarrheal diseases that dominate this problem. The water conflict chronology that's in the volume, there's also an online version at worldwater.org. This is a screenshot from that. You can get a map. You can sort the map by region, by conflict type, by date, all the way back to 3000 BC, for those of you who like history. And this is just, again, a screenshot of the last few years of water-related conflicts are listed here. You can click on any conflict and get a list of the sources behind it, the details of the conflict. It's a fun thing to look at if you're interested. By conflict type, we look at conflicts over access to water. I want your water, sort of the traditional resource tension conflict. You can click on attacks on water-related infrastructure, where a conflict starts for some other reason, or the use of water during a conflict as a weapon. There are water and terrorism is a separate category. You can look at a subset of all of those and explore all of them. And then I have some rare footage here of a specific water conflict where water was used as a tool during a war. And I'll just play a little, it's 30 seconds long if it'll work.
Break the dam! Release the river!
Over and over.
Hold on!
Okay. So it's rare we get footage of actual destructions of dams, the use of water in a war. I just thought I'd show that because it's in my list of water movies. But water has been used in this way. Dams have been attacked during real conflicts. Water has been used as a weapon during real conflicts. And the international community has not come to grips with how to integrate these kinds of resource issues into the security debate. This is the graph of per capita bottled water use in the United States from 1976 to 2010. You can see that exponential growth in bottled water use, the dip that may have partly been caused by the economy, although there have been economic downturns in the past, or partly perhaps by the growing awareness of environmental challenges associated with bottled water, or by more and more people not putting bottled water on podiums or carrying around refillable bottles. The bottled water industry has their own perception about this, and I won't go into that anymore. As I said, people are increasingly concerned about water. This is a graph that shows for a number of different countries of the world, the percent of the population very concerned about something. The blue column is water pollution, the red column is lack of safe drinking water, the green one is lack of water for agriculture, the next one, the purple one, is high cost of water. And you can see it varies from place to place, but populations care a lot about water. They care partly depending on where they are. If you're in Mexico, you're much more concerned about the lack of safe drinking water than if you're in a developed country. Often people are concerned about water pollution overall. Water is an issue of public concern. And in the United States, this is a time series from 2000 to 2010 from a consistent series of Gallup poll surveys. That is the percent of the US that worries about something. And they ask a series of questions about environmental issues. And it may seem that overall concern about environmental issues is going down. It goes up and it goes down. It may be that the total percentage isn't very high. This is people who worry a great deal about these issues. But in every one of these surveys, up or down, water's been at the top. Water has been the top 4 of the concerns. Climate change has been toward the bottom, it goes up, it goes down. Air pollution has sort of been in the middle. But the top 1 is pollution of drinking water. The next one is pollution of rivers and lakes. Toxic water contamination, including both soil and water, and then adequacy of fresh water supply. Those are the top 4, and they've been consistent over the last decade. So the public cares a lot about water. And all of these data are in the book. One of the most significant changes since 1978 is the role of China. I just have a couple of slides about China. There's been a massive growth in their economy, of course, and that has led to massive growth in their demand for water and massive contamination. Industrial contamination, human sewage, their wastewater treatment systems have not kept up. Their industrial water quality treatment has not kept up with their economic growth, and they now have a water quantity and a water quality problem, a massive one. The last volume of the world's water, the 2008-2009 volume, had a chapter broadly looking at China's water issues. This is something, again, the Woodrow Wilson Water Group and the China Group has done a lot of work on, and I commend their work to you. And the new volume addresses China's dam policies. Their internal dam policy, their policy on rivers that they share with neighboring countries, and their policy internationally, especially in Africa. China is probably the one nation on the planet that still has a massive dam construction policy going on. This is a graph that shows installed capacity from 2004 to 2009 in China and in Brazil, United States, and Canada, which are the next 3 largest countries with installed capacity. And you can see the United States and Brazil and Canada are not building new dams, in part because our big dam building eras were in the 1940s and 50s and 60s and 70s, in part because certainly in the United States we built on all the good dam sites, and as I like to say, some of the not so good dam sites. And there are limited places where we can build big dams for political reasons, for environmental reasons, for economic reasons. And China's behind us in that sense. So they're still building big dams, but China is where the big installed capacity growth is still occurring. And you can see their installed capacity is already much larger than the United States or Brazil or Canada. And we didn't have data for 2009 for these other three countries, but it hasn't changed much. But in addition, China's dam strategies are not just domestic, they're global. Chinese companies and financial interests, their banks, their international development assistance, are involved in at least 220 major dam projects in 50 countries around the world. And there's a list of them. One of the tables in the world's water is a list of these major dam projects, the Chinese companies that are involved. It's a big thing. They're also involved in building probably 19 or 20 of the 24 largest hydropower stations under construction around the world. And increasingly, those projects are controversial for environmental reasons, for political reasons. In 2006, there was a protest in the Sudan over a Chinese-funded hydroelectric project, and 4 villagers were killed during those protests. In 2009, China signed a very controversial agreement with Ethiopia over the Gibe Dam on the Omo River, a tributary to the Nile Basin, over the objections of Egypt. Egypt, needless to say, is extraordinarily sensitive to what happens upstream of them on the Nile River. Egypt is completely dependent on the Nile. 97% of their water comes from the Nile, and all of that water originates in countries upstream of them. And they're very sensitive to what happens upstream, especially in Ethiopia. In 2010, 51 Indian NGOs called on China and India to halt efforts to build dams on joint India-China rivers, on rivers that are shared by the two nations. The giant Myitsone Dam on the Irrawaddy River in Myanmar, in Burma, has provoked armed opposition in local communities in Myanmar, and people have been killed over that. And interestingly, just a few weeks ago, the government of Myanmar, the new civilian-backed government, announced that they were halting that project because of internal concern about the project. The main contractor on that project is Chinese. The main subcontractors are Chinese. The main funding is Chinese. The electricity was going to go to China, and a little bit to Myanmar and to Burma. There was an internal Chinese environmental report that the Chinese had done that said this project has serious environmental problems, but they never released it, and then it was leaked, and that caused a protest. But that project has now temporarily been suspended by the current government in Myanmar. Finally, it's time for a new U.S. water policy, to the extent that the U.S. has a water policy. Efforts to design new water policies, or national water policies, are expanding around the world. There have been new efforts in South Africa, in the European Union, in Australia, in Russia. We provide case studies of each of these in our chapter on U.S. water policy, about the different ways of thinking about national water concerns. But what we argue in this chapter is the U.S. has to clarify a whole series of things. We have to clarify our institutional roles and responsibilities. Where is it appropriate for the federal government to be involved in water policy, and where is it appropriate for water to be local? We have to think about updating our federal water laws. We have the Clean Drinking Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act, two remarkable federal laws to protect our drinking water and our rivers and lakes. They were passed in the late 60s. They were modified over the years. They're grossly out of date. There are new contaminants. There are new institutional issues. There are new economic strategies. There are new technologies for monitoring and measuring contamination. There are new issues around non-point sources of contamination in the United States. We have to update these laws, and I don't know how to get Congress to do that. It's their responsibility. I'm not holding my breath, but we need to do that. We ought to decentralize water management where appropriate and increase stakeholder participation. We need to collect more data. There are things we don't know that we need to know to have a national water strategy that makes sense. We need to apply modern economic principles in terms of subsidies. What do we really want to subsidize? What don't we want to subsidize? How do we deal with water pricing and markets? There are things that the federal government can do that can help in this area. We have to integrate changing climate. Climate change is going to have very significant impacts and is already having noticeable impacts on water resources in the United States. And climate change isn't integrated into the way we manage Western US water infrastructure, the way we deal with interstate water disputes, the way we think about extreme events, floods and droughts. We have to move from a supply focus to a demand focus, and there are things the federal government can do in that area as well. And then finally, I think we need to think about innovative communications around water. I'm going to show, do I have 3 or 4 more minutes? I'm going to show a 2.5-minute clip, the trailer basically, for a new movie that's coming out next spring. Participant Films, which did An Inconvenient Truth, which did Food Inc., which did Waiting for Superman, among other movies, is putting out a water documentary. I've seen it. I'm actually in it, and despite the fact that I'm in it, it's really good. I like it a lot. I got to see it a couple of weeks ago at the Toronto Film Festival. It'll be formally released in the spring, although I think they're going to do a screening next week in Washington. But let me show you the 2.5-minute trailer if I can make it work.
The single most necessary element for any of us to sustain and live and thrive is water.
We think of it as the air, infinite and inexhaustible. But when you use water in such quantities that it exceeds the capacity of the system to renew itself, you have a problem.
Farms all over the Central Valley have been allowed to dry up.
The drought in China's southwest region is the worst of the last century.
4,000 children die each day because of water shortages, and the situation is worsening.
In the scientific community, we're starting to think it's not drought, it's really part of climate change.
We can't take it for granted that the chemical can pass through silt or sand and on the other end come out pristine.
There is no future here because of the control of the water. They are gradually taking it away from the farmers. It won't be good.
This is raw sewage being discharged into the River Jordan.
It's not one lake. It's not just one well that's contaminated. It's 30, it's 300, it's 3,000.
If we were smart, we would dramatically rethink agriculture and urban water use. Over the last decade or so, Singapore has worked very hard to develop new, innovative sources of water.
It was Albert Einstein who said, "Those who have the privilege to know have the duty to act."
There's a common agenda for all of us, for every walk of life, and that's water.
So there are new ways of communicating around water. I urge you to see it when it comes out, if you're interested in water, and presumably you are. It's a beautiful film, actually. Jessica Yu, the director, I think did a wonderful job at trying to get the story across, both internationally and domestically, at some of the issues. So finally, the water problem is real and it's bad. It's not bad everywhere, it's not bad in the same way from place to place, but we're not doing what we need to do to address all of the different challenges around water. not everything is getting worse. There are success stories out there. There's good news. And in every volume of the world's water, we try and offer examples of what's really working, what is pointing us towards sustainable solutions, what's helping us think about extreme events or meeting basic human needs for water, or integrating the environment into our thinking about water, or dealing with reducing the risks of conflict over water. So not everything is getting worse. There are costs to not doing anything, however, and they're human and they're economic and they're political. We argue throughout the world's water that key principles ought to be implied, including a diversity of solutions. There is no one solution to the world's water problems. Proper application of economics and science, public participation and transparency, and environmental considerations. The day when we could ignore the environment in our decisions about water are over. And we need some new thinking. What solutions are sustainable, are scalable, and are socially responsible. And finally, we have to do more than we're doing in every aspect of water. We have to think about how to move more aggressively to solve water and sanitation problems. We have to move more actively and aggressively to solve all of these challenges. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Peter. Wide-ranging and insightful as usual. I think we'll turn to questions. I was remiss in not mentioning before that for those of you who are watching online or the live webcast or here in the room, if you're engaged in tweeting some of Peter's insights, we're using the hashtag #WorldsWater as a way to group those tweets. So why don't we throw the floor open for question, because we are webcasting. We ask that you wait for one of my colleagues to bring your microphone, if you could state your name and your question, and because we have a lot of folks and I'm sure a lot of questions, perhaps we'll take 2 or 3, Peter, and then give you a chance to respond, and then also ask that you kindly make them brief in terms of questions rather than speeches. So we'll start down here in the front.
Thank you, Peter. I am Richard Dagey from Johns Hopkins SAIS. We got our Clean Drinking Water Act in 1974. Since then, has a reliable metric been developed for aggregate water quality in America? And if so, has it improved? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I saw some hands over here, Lauren. Lakpreet.
Hi, my name is Lakpreet Kaur, and I was wondering if you could maybe speak about the worst and then the best policy that's been enacted in recent years and impacting freshwater access and resources.
Okay, so some models for us to follow. There's another hand right there in front, Lauren.
Hi, my name is Celeste. I have a question. What is the difference between the concept of pig water and pig oil?
Should we take those 3, Peter?
Sure. So first, aggregate water quality. I don't think we have a measure for aggregate water quality because water quality comes in different forms, and there are different kinds of contaminants and there are different kinds of water resources. Perhaps if there was any one measure, I think about deaths from water-related diseases as sort of an indicator of our failure to meet basic human needs for water. Maybe there's some kind of aggregate measure like that. But we are increasingly measuring water quality of different kinds with different kinds of measurements and in different places. Some water quality has improved, and we absolutely ought to be clear about that. Perhaps there's so many measures, it's hard to even know where to begin. The EPA measures fishable, swimmable streams, but we don't measure every stream. For example, in California, just last week, EPA announced that there was a huge increase in the number of streams considered not fishable, not drinkable, not swimmable. But part of that increase was because we're measuring better. Not that the quality has gotten worse, but that we're measuring more places and we're finding more problems. So partly it's things are getting worse, partly it's we need to measure better. So there are lots of different measures. The only other thing I'd say about that is that we're now measuring more things and more accurately. So there's a growing concern about pharmaceuticals in our water. There's a growing concern about trace chemicals in our water. Some of those things have probably been in our water for 30 years, but we're able to measure them at incredibly small concentrations now. Some of them are probably new. They haven't been, we didn't measure Viagra in our water in the past because they didn't invent it until recently, but there are all sorts of nasty pharmaceuticals in our water that we might not want. So it's that's a measurement issue. But the other associated issue is we don't know very well the real health consequences of some of those things because our epidemiology isn't keeping up with it. So all of those things are related, and I'll leave it at that. The worst and the best policies at the national level or the international level in general. Wow. I'll have to think about that. I'll think about that and I'll try and come up with a better answer. We have new international agreements, for example, on the Great Lakes, and we talk about that in one of the water briefs. I think it's a great agreement. It's not perfect because it's a political document, it's a subject of negotiation and so on. But the US and Canada have a new agreement about the Great Lakes, and that's a good thing. It sets a framework for resolving disputes over water allocation, over water quality, potentially over extreme events. It's not perfect, but it's a good start. On the bad side, I honestly don't have a good example of the worst, except that we're constantly passing water-related laws that don't take into account the integrated nature of the problem. So we'll pass a law that says, let's increase biofuel productions in the United States to get off of foreign oil, increase ethanol production. Okay, so that's a great idea if all you care about is imports of foreign oil. There's no doubt, I don't think there's anybody who would dispute that importing less oil from the Middle East would be a good thing. I think we agree about that. But when you increase biofuel production without thinking about water, for example, or food policy, bad things happen. The price of corn goes up. The price of food in the rest of the world goes up. Overdraft of aquifers in the Great Plains goes up. So that's an example of not a water policy, but a policy that had water implications that were bad because we didn't think about it. So there's one example. Peak water. So I won't give a whole peak water talk. I could have, but peak oil is the idea that eventually there's going to be a maximum production of oil worldwide, followed by a decline, because it gets harder and harder to get the next barrel of oil. Peak oil doesn't mean we're going to run out of oil. The world will never run out of oil. As it gets more expensive, we'll move to substitutes. As it gets harder to pump, we'll move to replacements. But there will be a peak in the production, and it'll decline. And the United States passed peak oil in 1970. The peak of oil production in the United States was 1970, and oil production in the United States has gone down ever since. It could go up again if oil, it may be edging up a little bit, but it'll never reach, in my opinion, the peak from 1970. But that's what peak oil is. Peak water is a little different. Peak non-renewable water, as I said, is like peak oil. When it's a non-renewable resource and you overpump it, the groundwater levels drop, like oil levels drop, gets more expensive to pump, and eventually your production of groundwater will drop. And we see this in the Ogallala Aquifer. We're pumping less than we used to because it's gotten too expensive for farmers. We see it in Thailand, where groundwater production has dropped because levels have gotten so expensive. We've overpumped groundwater. Peak renewable water is this idea that once you're using all of the renewable resource, you can't use any more. You might want more water from the Colorado River, but you can't have any more. And so there's a maximum amount from a renewable system that you can take. And that's the definition of peak renewable water. And I could go on, but that's sort of an overview. And if you really want to know more, buy the last volume of The World's Water and read chapter 1.
Or if you want it in 5 minutes, the video that Peter alluded to that he's done that's on the Wilson Center website on peak water. Kaylee, why don't we go in the back, a question there, and then we'll get a couple over here.
Hi, I'm Chelsea Burns from American University. I actually have a question about your Pacific Institute water privatization report. And in the report, you say that rates should be designed to encourage efficient and effective use of water, and that rate structure should permit companies to earn a return on efficiency and conservation investments. I was just wondering if you could talk about that a little bit.
Okay, terrific. Lauren, I think you have some over there.
My name's Martin Apple. If you looked at the current balance of maybe almost 3/4 of the world's water going to agriculture and 1/4 or so going to urban use, and both of those uses were to race as quickly as and effectively as possible to be the maximum conservation they could get out of their future over the next 10 or 20 years, how much conservation, how much less water would they both end up using?
Okay. Lauren, I think if you could grab a couple more of those and then.
Yeah, hi, it's Steve Solomon, writer and author. And hi, Peter. I really want to ask you just on the specific question of the United States, on the water energy nexus, what kind of data we might have and how difficult it's going to be to build out things like the shale oil in arid regions. We've seen it in like limitations on solar, but I haven't been able to come across any really good data on and projections. Maybe you have something.
That's great. While Lauren brings the microphone down here, I'll urge you, Steve, to talk to Paul Faith, 2 rows in front of you almost precisely. He's got a lot of data at CNA on exactly that question. Please.
Robert Reynolds from the Atlantic Council. Similar question to the last one. You mentioned that you looked at hydraulic fracturing in the chapter on fossil fuels and water quality. Did you also look at tar sands exploitation and possible impacts from the Keystone XL pipeline? And if you did you bring those findings to the attention of the people who'll be making the decision on it?
Okay, all great questions as always here. On our the privatization report, we don't talk about privatization much in this volume of the World's War, although there's a chapter in another volume. But the bottom line there is that water is a human right. I feel very strongly about that. But water is also an economic good. I pay for water services, and I ought to pay for water services. And the reality is what I pay for water services ought to reflect the true total costs of providing that water to me, not just the building the infrastructure, but the environmental costs of my using water. And it is possible, well, first of all, rarely do we pay the full cost of water anywhere. And the more that we pay the full cost of water, the more likely we are to use it more efficiently, like any other resource. And so one of the things we have long argued is use smart economics to encourage efficient and productive use of water and to protect natural ecosystems and so on. And part of that is rate design. We can design rates, as we've done in the energy industry, so that the largest users of water pay the highest prices and are encouraged to implement water conservation and efficiency technology or strategies, because water's pretty cheap. And so that's really the short answer to that. I think such rate designs can be designed and implemented. We're beginning to do that in the Western US and elsewhere, but I think we're just at the beginning of exploring different kinds of rate designs that let utilities cover their costs and yet give the right signal to the user to encourage conservation and efficiency. So that's the answer there. Marty's question about efficiency again in agriculture and urban. Nobody has done an assessment worldwide about the potential for conservation and efficiency to save water in the urban and agricultural sectors. But pieces have been done of that work. And we've done it, for example, in the Western US and in California. And I'll give you some numbers for there just to give you a little sense of this. Even in California, where we've spent a lot of time and money talking about conservation and efficiency and implementing programs, our estimate is that we could still save more than 1/3 of all urban water use, current urban water use, with existing technology, cost effectively. We could do what we're doing. We could do what we want flush our toilets and make semiconductors and do the industrial and commercial and residential things that we do in the urban sector with a third less water than we're doing now, at least. So that's on the urban side. On agriculture, again, we looked at the potential with smart irrigation systems, with better monitoring of soil moisture and timing of application of water. We didn't even look at crop shifting. We didn't even look at fallowing land. And our estimate was we could, with existing technology, cost effectively save 10 to 15% of the water in agriculture, which is a huge volume of water because they use so much more of the total amount. I think the potential is larger than that, but easily 10 to 15%. And I think worldwide, there's probably even more potential. On the water energy nexus question, there are data. We're actually doing a project that we're just about to release on water and energy in the Intermountain West and different scenarios for energy futures and the water implications of those scenarios. We do talk in this volume of the world's water in the fossil energy and water chapter, not just about fracking, but about shale oil and tar sands and the water implications of those. We don't explicitly talk about the Keystone XL pipeline, I don't think, in that chapter. Although I did sign a letter with a group of scientists that went to the president asking him to be very careful in the administration's decision about the Keystone pipeline. My worry is actually not, ironically enough, a break in the pipeline and contamination of groundwater. That's been raised as a potential issue with the pipeline. That's always a problem with pipelines, but I'm not worried about that. I'm much more worried about two other issues, and this is true of tar sands in general. The enormous amount of water required to produce tar sands. It's an incredible problem in Canada, both the quantity of water and the water quality issues associated. It takes a lot of water to produce a unit of energy of tar sands compared to almost any other kind of fossil fuel. And I'm worried about the greenhouse gas emissions. Tar sands and oil sands are incredibly, the CO2 per unit water, or the CO2 per unit of kilowatt hour produced, or the CO2 per gallon of oil produced is very high. And I worry not just about water, but I worry about greenhouse gas implications. And that's the nature of my concern in that area. Interestingly, solar thermal, central solar thermal plants in the western United States can be water intensive. Not photovoltaics, but the solar thermal systems. And that's something that some western states are very aware of. And so, for example, in California, they're beginning to permit big central solar systems, but they're requiring that they use dry cooling, not wet cooling, because the cooling system determines the water consumption. So that's another good example of the energy-water nexus. It's not just fossil fuels, it's renewables under some circumstances. You have to think about energy and water together. So implement solar thermal, perhaps, but require dry cooling so there's not a big water footprint. That's an issue as well. I think that was all of the questions.
Have time for get Link Day in the middle, and then lady right here, and then come down the gentleman here.
I'm Lincoln Day. I'm a retired demographer. This was a most impressive presentation. It's comprehensive, very insightful.
Thank you.
In mentioning the relation between water and conflict, you showed the use of water as a weapon of destruction, weapon of war, and you also mentioned water as something people will fight over. There was, however, no mention of water as a victim of war, and I think of the leakage of oil from some 4,000 ships sunk in World War II in the South Pacific, and also of the fact that water is a wonderful means of distributing pollution, say, from nuclear testing, things of that sort.
Terrific. Why don't we get a couple more? And I should say, we commend to you Link and Alice Day's film Scarred Lands. It looks at environment and conflict, and particularly the impacts of conflict on on the environment. Lauren, yes, ma'am, please.
I'm Renee Martin-Nagel with the Environmental Law Institute, and I'd like to ask you to comment on the increasing popularity of biofuels and their water requirement and how that will impact the availability of water for agriculture and other uses.
Okay, Lauren, while you bring that down here, maybe Kaylee, the gentleman in the blue shirt, has a question.
Yeah, two quick questions. One, now that the price of desalination has gotten down to 54 cents, what effect do you think that's going to have on broader international policy? And the second is sort of operationalizing water as a human right. What do you see as equitable utilization, per capita use, amounts of water per person, as far as water as a human right?
I'm going to take this gentleman right here, and then in the next round we'll have you guys here. So apologies. Thank you. Please.
Hello, my name is Eric Sainer with the Department of Energy. I believe that a few years ago, Sandy was leading a team of national laboratories and other organizations putting together a water energy nexus roadmap. Whatever happened to that? Did it ever come out?
Okay, Peter.
Okay. Again, great questions. I love this. So Lincoln, I didn't mention it, but we do, the water conflict chronology explicitly talks about water as a victim and target of conflict. So that clip I showed from the two towers, oddly enough, that could be either the use of water as a weapon during war, or contamination of water during a conflict that starts for other reasons. It depends on which side of the two towers you're standing on. But there are examples in the conflict chronology from both of those, and I think it's a great point that you raise. And there are interesting examples as well where water's been contaminated, not just for war or conflict purposes, but for other political purposes. It's a big issue. On biofuels, I touched on that a little bit, but it's this conflict between the desire to produce energy in a more renewable way and its implications for other resources like water and food. Biofuels has implications for water, but it also has implications for land devoted to food production. And that's something I don't think we've adequately addressed. I do think there's a role for biofuels. I just think we have to be really careful about the policies we put in place to implement them in order to get the biofuels we want, but without causing disruption of food production. The world's population is about to reach 7 billion people. I usually try and talk about population in all of my talks at least a little bit, but we have to grow food for a growing population, and there's no more land, not much more land to be brought into production. So we have to become more productive in our agricultural industry as well, and that's running up against a biofuels issue, a conflict with biofuels. On desalination, first of all, I would dispute that desal is down to 54 cents a cubic meter. I would dispute that vociferously, although the desal industry would like to believe that. The cost of desal is coming down. It's coming down slowly, although some would argue that it stopped coming down in recent years, that in fact it's gone back up a little bit. The cost of desal is also a function of who's citing it and assumptions about labor costs and land costs and energy costs and so on. The Israelis claim they've built some desal plants for around 50 to 60 cents a cubic meter, but the land was subsidized and the energy subsidized, and but without getting into that too much, the cost of desal is coming down. We are going to see more desalination. Desalination is a way of expanding the supply of water because it lets us tap into the 97% of the world's water that's salt water. It will increasingly become important for high-valued industrial uses where whatever the price of water really is, the cost of desal really is, we're willing to pay it. Increasingly, that's the Persian Gulf and the Middle East and Spain and Singapore. There are more, and Australia. There are more big desalination plants being put in place. And so I do think it'll be a mix. It'll be a part of the mix when we're willing to pay the cost and when we're willing to build the plants properly. So I accept that. I couldn't resist challenging the 54 cent a cubic meter argument. and then the roadmap. Okay, so I could ask you that question. I'd love to know where the roadmap is. There have been 26 drafts of it or something like that. It's gone back and forth. I don't know if it'll ever be released. I don't know what's holding it up. I was involved very early, and I was on a science advisory committee, and I left early, thank God. Not because I knew then that it was never going to see the light of day, but because their focus really was on the amount of water required for energy systems. And I think that's important, but I'm also interested in the amount of energy that's required for water systems, and they weren't interested in looking at that piece of the puzzle. I would ask Sandia Labs and the DOE where, I throw the question back to you. I don't know where it is.
I think there was some talk of it also being punted to the National Academy.
Oh, God.
So we know that'll be out really quickly as a result. So there was the gentleman down here in the blue for another round, and then there was a hand over here somewhere.
Hi, Noah Lichtenstein. Thanks for the talk today. I was wondering, you talked about the conservation, possible conservation for agriculture and urban uses. I was wondering what the different marginal cost curves look like for those conservation measures. Is it something that will save agricultural companies money, or is it something that you need to internalize those externalities you talked about? Thank you.
Okay, was there a hand over here? No? There are others? Yes, ma'am, please.
Hi, Peter. Thank you. I was just wondering if you can talk about any instances where privatization has actually worked.
And sorry, ma'am, if you could just let us know who you are. So.
I'm sorry, Anita Street, Department of Energy, and I don't know where the roadmap is.
Thank you. All right, do we have some other questions for this round? All the way in the back. Yep. Sorry, it's in the dark, can't see.
Hi, Carol Dumaine. Thank you, Peter, for your address. I have a question regarding the interdependencies that you kept emphasizing. You said that your institute realized after several years that these things had to be looked at in a connected fashion. And with regard to the roadmap example you just discussed, there was the same problem. So the question is, how do we institutionalize this systems awareness and make it actionable?
Thank you, Carol.
Okay. Thank you again. So marginal costs, another great question. The costs of efficiency and increasing productivity obviously depend on where you are. It depends on what's already been put in place. It depends on the cost of water. It depends on our ability to internalize externalities and whether we're really truly paying the costs of water. It depends on national economies. It depends on a lot of different things. So there's no easy answer to that. But the work that I described that we had done in California on agricultural and urban efficiencies looked at the marginal costs of efficiency improvements compared to the marginal cost of new supply, for example. And when I said that there was maybe 30% potential improvement in urban efficiency and 10 to 15% in agricultural efficiency that was cost effective, what I meant by that was the marginal cost of efficiency was less than the marginal cost of new supply. And so we actually looked specifically at that. And in those reports, we actually have cost curves that look at those things. And it varies enormously depending on what you're implementing. It gets to some of these other questions about cross-cutting issues. One of the things we learned in our studies was that it's not enough just to look at the cost of water that you're saving. So sometimes a conservation measure doesn't save enough water from an economic point of view to be cost effective. But if you look at water and energy together, it may be cost effective. If you look at water, energy, and the ecosystem impacts that are avoided because you don't have to take water out of an ecosystem because of the conservation measure, maybe it's cost effective. And one simple example is dishwashers and washing machines. So there are new dishwashers and washing machines that use less water than the old ones. Sometimes they have an additional capital cost. They're more expensive than the inefficient ones. And sometimes the amount of water that's saved isn't enough to cover the cost of the added increment of the new technology. But those also save energy, because they're not just saving water, they're saving hot water. So if you only look at the water savings and you don't look at the hot water savings and the energy savings, you get a different answer. And it turns out that some of the most cost-effective water efficiency savings options are things that save hot water. So it's a good example of the need to cut across boundaries. So there, I want my water utility and my energy utility to play together. I want them both to offer me a rebate for my washing machine. And in fact, when I bought a new front-loading washing machine, I got a rebate from my electric utility and from my natural gas and from my water utility. So that's a good example of a smart policy to encourage a user to do something differently. Where has privatization worked? I'm not opposed to privatization. I think there's a role for privatization. Again, as I said earlier, I believe very strongly there's a human right to water. Well, water is also an economic good. In the United States, 85% of our water utilities are public. And they're public agencies because in the 1800s, when almost all of our city agencies were private, they didn't work. And cities took them over and they made them work. And our municipal systems are great. And they sell municipal bonds to fund them at a low rate, and they're mostly well run. But 15% of our water systems are still privately run. And for the most part, they're pretty well run because they're overseen by public agencies, because there's public transparency involved, because they're monopolies and we have public oversight of them. So if we have private systems, let's make sure that they're transparent and that the public interest is protected. And I think that's probably the better answer. In Great Britain, Margaret Thatcher privatized all the water agencies, and it was a disaster at first because there was no public transparency and no public oversight. And it wasn't until the Office of Water, Ofwat, was put in place to protect, to deal with complaints, to make sure that these private water companies implemented infrastructure improvement projects rather than sucking up all the profits, did they solve some of those problems. And finally, Carol's question about the roadmap and how to make it, what was it, how to make it work? Okay,
How do you make people aware of that before you get to the end of the project?
So what we've maybe learned not to do is to pass these laws that aren't integrated. I'm sorry, we haven't learned that, but we need to learn that. The biofuels one is the ethanol example is a good example. They had the best of intentions, some of them, going into that, but they didn't think about food and they didn't think about water. So there are over 20 federal agencies that deal with water. NOAA deals with climate and weather. EPA deals with the Safe Drinking Water Act, with the Clean Water Act. The Department of the Interior is responsible for Western water projects. The Department of Agriculture's got a role to play. USGS collects water data. I could go on. There are over 20 of them. They don't play together very well. And so one of the recommendations in our U.S. water policy chapter and in the book that's coming out is we need to institutionally deal with water a little more effectively and efficiently at the federal level in order to avoid the kinds of mistakes that dealing with water in a compartmentalized way produces. So I don't know how to make that happen. It's a recommendation that it happen. OSTP, the Office of Science and Technology Policy, is trying to do that. There's an integrated federal task force that's dealing with water. There are some efforts underway to do this. And so that's, I think, one of the ways to move forward.
Terrific. Well, Peter, as usual, you've given us kind of an agenda for better understanding these issues, but also pointing us in directions that challenge us in terms of how we're responding to them in research realm, as well as obviously the doer realm of policy and practice. You do us a great service by being provocative and throwing these issues out, as well as having an eye towards including chapters on issues before they become assumed that this is an issue. You're kind of identifying things over the horizon. And then Carol Dumain's point is a good one. Your emphasis on integration and how these things connect, and using water not as a single sectoral issue, but one that connects to so many of the priorities we have, I think is an excellent reminder that we have to find ways to integrate the systems thinking and work across these different areas. I should say, again, congratulations to you and your colleagues, to Island Press. We will urge you to take advantage of these resources on, obviously, the Pacific Institute's website, Island Press website. We hope that what is also on the Wilson Center website with short videos, some of which we'll go tape a few more here momentarily, give you a sense and help answer questions like what's peak water, and get that in the kind of 2 or 3 minute distilled version from Peter himself, and places like our blog News Security Beat. I haven't cleared this with Peter, but I'm volunteering him to take your questions, to again encourage you to use the hashtag World's Water on Twitter. I'm sure he would welcome follow-on questions that you might have that you can pose via that mechanism with that identifier, and we at the Wilson Center will keep track of that and share that with Peter. And he has regular op-eds and blog posts that would give him opportunity to respond to
And
those
tweets.
questions. And that's right, at Peter Gleick, right? So won't you join me in thanking Peter for today's presentation?
Thank you very much. Thank you.
I should say, please avail yourself of the opportunity to pick up the book. I'm assuming the bookseller is still out there, and I'll give you a chance to catch Peter and maybe get his signature as well.
Thank you, Jeff.
Yeah.